Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Van Maren Show on LifeSiteNews.com. My name is Jonathon van Maren, and today I'm going to be talking to Barbara Kay. Now, those of you who are from Canada will recognize her name almost immediately, as she is one of the very few interesting Canadian columnists left. Over the past several years, we've seen a sort of chilling effect over journalism and over column writing, especially as the number of opinions someone is allowed to articulate has grown steadily smaller. It's grown increasingly difficult to critique the new gender ideology, for example, or to say anything socially conservative in general without getting shouted and booed out of editorial rooms. We know that at a lot of different newsrooms, you have young woke employees that demand that, conservative columnists, conservative writers who have been around for decades, or liberal writers who simply still hold views that are considered classically liberal to themselves, but are now considered unacceptable, essentially be forced off of the platform. And Barbara Kay is one of those liberals who stayed liberal while almost everybody else shifted further left and went progressive. She has interesting views on almost everything. She's almost impossible to fit into any box. She spent the last several years pushing back against the transgender agenda. Her most recent column in the National Post is on gender and is once again dedicated to triggering the sorts of people who find that there is now new dogmas and new heresies, and in many cases, we've simply switched places. So Barbara Kay agreed to come on and have a conversation about the state of media in general, about column writing, about her long career in publishing here in Canada, on many of her most controversial opinions, and what she thinks the future looks like. This is that conversation. So the first question would be, how did you get involved in commentary and writing and in journalism?
Well, I always had a background in interpretive writing because I was an English major, and I have a master's in English literature, which involves obviously interpretive literary commentary and a lot of essay writing and a lot of critical thinking. I taught for many years composition and writing, so my writing skills, I was always a competent writer in the slightly academic vein. So it wasn't a tremendous shift to move those skills into journalistic style polemics in opinionating. And what got me interested in journalism was living in Quebec through two referenda. I'm from Toronto originally, but I lived through the most tumultuous period of Quebec's modern history, and by the time of the second referendum in 1995, I had gone from being not what you would call a politicized person. I mean, somebody who's very aware, attentive, a reader, interested, but not myself an activist, to very much engaged with the whole Quebec political scene and very much an activist, obviously, on the no side of the separatists' referendum. And I did start to write then for a small magazine that had originally been founded by Pierre Trudeau and some of his allies in the 60s, and it was called Cité Libre, which originally was only in French. And then under the direction of two editors, bilingual editors, became a bilingual magazine for a while. And it was totally dedicated to the anti-separatist movement. And although not read by many people, it was read by a lot of politicians. So it sort of punched above its weight. And I was really thrilled to be published. There is some really top-notch writers and thinkers engaged with that magazine. So that gave me a taste for it. Then the National Post started in 1999. Was it 98 or I think 98? Anyways, and my son at the time, who was a lawyer, a tax lawyer in New York, auditioned for and got a spot on the very first editorial board. And so that was a big shock to our family. He'd always loved writing, but he'd had this career, very oriented to first engineering and then law, and he just established himself in with a great job in New York, and suddenly he announced, I'm becoming a journalist. And one of the galvanizing aspects of that change in his life was, oh my gosh, you mean you can just become a journalist without special training or special education? Or, it was sort of a shock to me to realize that you could sort of transfer skills that you'd built up in another area and just go into journalism. So that gave me the impetus to see if I could branch out from the Quebec scene, which was very narrow and very focused. I did receive encouragement when I submitted my first stuff. Everybody thinks it was my son that got me going there, but in fact, he was not in a position to do that. And all he did was tell me who to send my stuff to, and I did, and yada yada. So 2003, there I am. I now have a career at the age of 60. So that's my story.
So what developed your views over the years? Because you're kind of like a classical liberal, which would now be considered wildly conservative. But like, I'm only 32, and I remember when that wasn't considered wildly conservative. So that wasn't all that long ago. How did your views develop?
Well, I think I was very much typical of my generation. I went to university in the early 60s. Yes, I was a classical liberal. It all made very reasonable sense to me. Rights of the individual, not the group. Everybody's equal under the law. Freedom of speech, freedom of conscience. All those things seem to me no-brainers. I never even thought I never thought to define myself politically, because I was what every reasonable person I knew was. And besides, at university, where I was very lucky to be one of the relatively few women who have both the opportunity, the motivation, and the encouragement to go to university, to a great university, University of Toronto, at a time when the universities were expanding at a very rapid pace. So they were spending tons of money on getting really high caliber academic professionals from England and abroad, wherever they had to come from. They were paying a lot. So I had the benefit of phenomenal teachers, and in an honors course that was considered, very high status. And there I had the kind of professors who were extremely demanding. They expected, when you wrote an essay, for example, they'd sit down with you after and they'd say, this is crap. There was they weren't concerned about your feelings or anything else. It was like, look, you start with this introductory statement. Where's your evidence? You then bring in this, and it's a bad analogy. Like, they go through it with you, and they'd say, you got to do better than this. This is sloppy, and where's the scholarship here? So over 4 years, I learned how to think critically. That was their goal. They didn't tell us what to think. I never had a single professor whose politics I was aware of or made to be aware of, or I never knew what their personal opinions on morality or social justice. There was no such thing as that then, just justice. But their subject was their subject. We looked at literature not in terms of deconstruction and power imbalance and all that jazz that was theory that was going to come later. We looked at it as literature. What was it saying? What did it reflect about its age? I learned history through literature, and we didn't have gender politics then. It was actually just, I was on the cusp just before feminism was making its breakthrough. So my entire education was pre-feminism, very heavy emphasis on learning critical thinking skills, and classic liberalism as the prevailing cultural environment. And I stuck with it. So yeah. I'm now an anomaly, but I'm very comfortable in my own skin with what I haven't seen any improvement on what I learned, in terms of all the ideologies that have come along. I see I see a lot of problems with all of them. And I think in a way, I came to my own young maturity at a time of peak rationality in public life.
Well, it's very interesting because I was actually taking an English minor. I did a history major, then an English minor at Simon Fraser University. I ended up dropping the minor because all they were doing was taking works of literature that I loved and ruining them. There was no exploration of the human experience and the human psyche. It was all there was always an oppressor. Jane Austen's characters were always beaten down rather than triumphant, and the whole thing just got to be exhausting. So I dropped the minor and just did a double major. What are some of the things that you saw starting to happen after your education with these different ideologies and the impact they had on the culture that have started to change the conversation now? Because to me, I went to a left-wing university, but I went to SFU, so you get what you pay for. It wasn't any mystery about SFU's ideological leanings, but things. I graduated from university 10 years ago this month. And things are extraordinarily different on campuses just in those past 10 years, much less than in the time you've been observing them.
When I left university was exactly the moment when the counterculture was kind of brewing. At Berkeley, at places in the United States, it was already happening. And you could feel it coming in the Canadian universities. But I was at that point already married, and my interests were already off campus more than on in graduate school. And so I did not get involved in campus life in any political sense. My first awareness of the big thing was feminism. And I did take notice of that. And I was very aware of this sort of revolutionary spirit brewing. And at first, feminism appealed in the sense that it was a kind of reform movement that I thought, oh yeah, well, that makes sense. Women need more legal rights. Women should have the right to choose whether they want to have family. I mean, those were all perfectly reasonable demands in the first years of feminism, but I never bought into the tremendous depth of anger. I remember reading Betty Friedan, this whole idea that women lived in concentration camps, domestic concentration camps. I says, oh, give me a break, Betty. Here was, she was somebody from my own cultural background. She was, Jewish, except she was very left-wing. I wasn't, okay. She went to university. She was not herself in any concentration camp. She was a Marxist. She ruled her household with an iron fist, I understand. So I thought, well, the leaders of this movement, I'm skeptical of what they're saying simply because they're talking about other women. They're not talking about themselves. And I began to see that, first of all, it was a very white middle-class movement, the feminist movement. It was not coming up from below. It was not a grassroots movement. It began in the academy and pretty well remained there for a very long time. And certainly the ideology remained in the academy, and most women did not sign on to a lot of the precepts and the doctrines. So I was skeptical from the beginning because I had not experienced in my lived experience. I had grown up in what was supposed to be the patriarchy, but I had been encouraged by my father. I was one of three sisters. And their expectations were very high, that we would do well in school, we would go to university, that we would achieve something in life, that we, I remember my older sister was encouraged to become a lawyer because she had, she liked arguing, and she was very bright. I was a very early believer in the idea that your cultural environment and the values that you grow up with are more important than politics or any ideas of patriarchy or any of the big grand ideas. That's not how people live. They don't live by grand ideas. They grow up in households and they take in by osmosis the kind of self-respect they're going to have. I mean, when I looked around at the women I knew, Jewish women in middle-class households, I didn't see downtrodden concentration camp victims. I saw strong, very strong, powerful women who ruled their domestic scene with great assurance, and who were deferred to. It's true they had their own domain, but in that domain, they were doing tremendous amounts of volunteer work. They were, charities. They had study groups. They were educating themselves in all kinds of ways. They had high expectations for their children. I myself did not feel downtrodden by men. I had good men in my life. I admired them. I was encouraged by them. So this whole idea, I never experienced in my own social environment, attitudes by the boys that I grew up with, these supposedly, hostile, toxic, all that jazz. Since I didn't experience it, I had to wonder, well, why am I not experiencing this? And this is supposedly a universal precept. And then I said, well, no, I can see that in some places there is such a thing as patriarchy, and other places not so much. Very, very dependent on individual enclaves and clusters, cultural clusters. Feminism taught me to be skeptical and to analyze, who's in charge of the ideology and what's their, is there another agenda? And of course, there is another agenda with feminism, a Marxist agenda. And I'm I should say that one of the great influences in my growing up was the Cold War. So that was one thing, although I was not political in an activist sense, I was very politicized and scared and horrified by the effects of Marxism on societies. I was very conscious of life in the Soviet Union, what it was like. I was very scared about the bomb, and all these were very big influences in my life. So I was already very antithetical to anything that smacked of a Marxist ideological base, and pretty well everything that we're discussing now, or that has come out of and that you experienced, is because of Marxism that permeates all the ideologies that we're currently living with.
It's interesting that you bring up the Cold War, because for so many writers of your generation that I've spoken with, they constantly refer to it. Not a lot of people my age have read Whittaker Chambers, but back in the day, people like him and Solzhenitsyn were profoundly influential. One of the interesting things I once read that I wanted to ask you about, Peter Hitchens said once in a very, and the sort of column that he writes when he's trying to get everybody's hackles up, he wrote that he misses the Berlin Wall because when the Berlin Wall was up, communism was trapped behind it. But since it's down and the left no longer has to defend the evil empire, they can pretend it never existed. And essentially they can start repromulgating all of these ideologies as if they've never been tried and seek to have them tried once again. What are your thoughts on that based on what you see?
What an interesting contrast to Christopher.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's right about that. When you have grown up with something that is so immediate, or even, just having the Holocaust having happened in your lifetime. I was a child, but I was very aware of that. And then you see, as you get older, what for you were overwhelmingly present and dangerous situations that you feel, nobody will ever forget this, and this will change the course of humanity. This will, and then you gradually, over your same lifetime, you see these dangers receding from memory. You see the lies that start coming out, because even though they're very well documented, one of the things about ideology in general is its tendency to airbrush the past and to say, since everything was wrong in the past, we're starting fresh. We don't need the past. We don't need history to teach us anything, because we're creating the new man. That was the mistake of Marxism to begin with, and it's being repeated because the Soviet example and the Maoist examples, so horrendous in their time, the sheer numbers have been airbrushed out. And I'm constantly pinching myself to say, what are these people drinking, to talk about socialism, real socialism, as a benign kind of system that is actually going to perfect society. We've been there, we did that, and it was horrible, horrible. So yeah, I think the Berlin Wall, when it was up, it didn't let us forget. Coming down, it opened the door to a kind of deformation of the past.
Like a lot of times, the past is denied to such an extent it kind of feels like we're all being gaslit, and you see this dissension even on the left. So you've got guys dressed in black shirts beating people up on the streets and calling themselves anti-fascist. Like it's so bold, it's almost intentional. You have Barack Obama saying, don't say defund the police, we don't want to do that. And then immediately he's responded by the squad, like, what are you talking about? No, we absolutely do. So you have some people saying the quiet part out loud. You have other more moderate left-wingers saying, no, that's too far for us. But also the extent to which what was once such normal perspective is now considered to be so radical and so horrifying, which I know you've experienced yourself. But like Rex Murphy, who's sort of like this Canadian icon and has been around forever. He trends on Twitter every time he writes a column, like every single time. Now, I don't even have to check the National Post for when his column comes out because he's just trending on Twitter. I'm like, oh, Rex's new column must, be out, and I'll go over and read him. This guy was on CBC for decades, right? He's just and it's crazy to me at age 32 to see what has become unacceptable in just the last 10 years. And so when you look at your writing career starting at the National Post until now, what are some of the major shifts you've identified in your ability to speak your mind and how difficult it's been, and some of the ways in which newsrooms seem to be constantly subjected to these struggle sessions where editors are apologizing to staff wokelings? It's just very strange.
It is very strange. When I look back over the 20 years I've been writing for the National Post, of course, the whole idea of staffers telling management or editorial what they're allowed to say is so bizarre, and it would never have entered my mind that this would be a possibility. It's only in the last 10 years that all the students that were having all this ideological junk downloaded into them and told it's no longer enough to just understand the power system and the oppressed system. You have to be an activist, and if you're not an activist, then you're not. Then you're part of the system. You're part of the bad system. So they've been trained to be missionaries and sent out into the world, and now we're seeing the result of that indoctrination and that training, recruitment and training. I mean, all the most of the humanities and anything that ends in ology, practically in the universities, is they're basically recruitment channels to send armies out into the world and infiltrate. The long march through the institutions. It's happened. It's a successful takeover of the institutions, and then you get these young people who actually think it's their duty to stand up and tell their employers where they're going wrong and what they have to do, and this is racist and that's no good, and this one needs to be canceled, and so that would never have entered my head in my wildest dreams to tell an employer, in my day, you didn't like what your employer was doing, you quit and you went to work for an employer that you wanted to work for, but you didn't tell them what to do. I mean, that's already happened. So I would say that what has changed for me personally is that I look back over some of my old columns, and I was free to say a lot of things about Islamism, gender stuff, feminism, rape culture, all that stuff. I said what I felt was true and not true. And so what got me into trouble in the last couple of years was an ideology that I have to say is more successful more quickly and with more ability to dictate its terms. That's the trans ideology. And so for the last couple of years, when I write about gender, it's caused a certain, tension. And that built up until finally and I've been writing more and more about it because it has become a dominant cultural trend, where it used to be civil rights for gay people and gay marriage. And then it was now gays are, they're old fashioned. They're not in the picture. It's all about trans. So every time I've been writing about trans in the last year or two, I started noticing that there was tension in the editorial section, that my columns were being held up. They were having to go through several layers of editorial. Sometimes they were getting spiked. That's not a good feeling for a journalist to get spiked. It shouldn't happen very often. It started to happen with kind of regularity. And at one point, I just said, I'm feeling very insecure about everything that I write now. And I'm nervous about whether this is going to pass or that. So that you can't write with joy in those circumstances. And I said, well, I had a good run, right? I was there for 20 years, and I'm a certain age, and it's no shame to retire from, I'd rather walk away before I'm asked to leave. And I got the impression, falsely as it happened, that my job was in question, or I'm a freelancer, so that my tenure there was in question. And maybe I should have approached them to talk about it, but I was afraid that if I brought it up, that might be the provocation that they needed to. So a combination of my own paranoia and their failure to say, hey, we've been spiking your columns. Let's talk about that. And let me explain the kind of tensions that we're experiencing at the moment. But that didn't happen either. So I walked away, and that did spark a discussion with management. I had very productive discussions with management, with higher up editorial. And they explained, hey, we went through some bad times, just like most of the other newspapers did, the New York Times and all these other cancel culture newspapers where editors have been let go for a headline that didn't appeal to, staffers. So there's just been a lot of turmoil in the media business based in activism in the ranks, in the rank and file. And they said, we're going to do something about that. And if we do, we hope you'll come back. I said, if you do, and if I feel free to write the way I've been writing in the past, then I would be happy to come back. I feel it's my home, and I love it. And that's what happened. So now I feel that my old sense of comfort, and they really have returned to brand. They had an editorial on it. There was a moment there, where more than a moment, where I think people felt, and it was Rex, as you say, Rex. Rex isn't on Twitter. That's probably why he feels free to write about it.
Right. Probably.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. He doesn't. He's got a wonderful total lack of awareness of what you can and can't say. People who are on Twitter, whether they fret or disagree with the kind of oppression that Twitter exercises on you, and whether they fight back or not, we're all of us that are on Twitter extremely aware of what will get us harassed on Twitter and what won't. And that does have an effect. It's interesting because that does have an effect on your writing, in the sense that you're looking for a word. Ooh, if I use that word, that's not going to fly well. So Rex is totally oblivious to all that, which I think is good for his writing. And he'll say things like, there's no systemic racism in Canada. He doesn't understand that the word systemic racism don't mean
systemic and then racism.
Well, it's code for you have to say there's systemic racism or you are a racist. Like, he doesn't understand the rules of the game, which are not, we didn't make them and we don't like them, but a lot of people think these are now entrenched rules, right? If you're not on Twitter and you're a great writer like Rex is, you just blithely carry on. And because his readership is huge and people love him, the ordinary people, not the woke people, the newspaper can afford to let him rip, He's, it's like J.K. Rowling. People, it doesn't matter how many people disparage her or how many people in her publishing house, don't want her published. She's too big to fail, and she's too big to be canceled. She pays a price. She pays a psychological price for the mobbing that she's subjected to. But so Rex, in his own way, is a, in his slightly minor way, is that kind of a figure. So I have to walk a certain line.
One of the questions I really wanted to ask you, especially about the way Canada's been presented, is that so the history books I grew up reading had sort of good and evil narrative arcs, right? So the story of Jim Crow would be told, and then the culmination of the book would be, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and progress was always viewed as these vast number of interminable steps towards slowly but surely becoming better. That we aren't where we should be, but we're not where we were. That, we're not yet perfect, but we're not as bad as we were 50 years ago. That we're consistently fixing things, changing things. And that was true for both Canada and the United States. I remember because I took a history degree, Indigenous studies is always a pretty healthy part of that. It's mandatory in Canadian universities. And the one class I don't regret taking was with Gwen Point, who was the wife of Canada, BC's Lieutenant General at the time. And she took us to an abandoned residential school. We went, in the basement where they would lock kids up for punishment. And this thing was closed in the 80s, right? It's very, very recently. And so all of that being true, what I have a hard time understanding about my generation and younger, because I'm a millennial, so Gen Z coming up would be a big part of this as well, is the extent to which the narrative has now changed. The narrative now is we're thoroughly evil and we have to burn it all down. And if you point out that things aren't as bad now as they were 25 years ago, if you point out that things are bad on some reserves, there are injustices that need to be rectified, but the residential schools have been closed down and apologized for example, that segregation is universally frowned upon, that things that used to be common in the culture are now universally considered to be wicked. Like the Overton window has shifted definitively on many issues for the better, but to say that is to be denying our own wickedness to some extent. And it's been kind of bewildering to see the extent to which defending Canada, which used to be a Canadian pastime, for example, is pretty likely to get you called out as a racist or a person of privilege, et cetera, et cetera. What is your take on how all of this has developed?
Well, I agree with you that I think that narrative happens to be true. The fact that, our ancestors, our forefathers, did crappy things to people they considered inferior. That was the prevailing idea, that there was, and racism is a thing. But there's also been progress made, great progress, because enlightenment may come slowly, but it comes surely. And it has come. And, you don't get official civil rights acts in countries where there is no progress or where there's no idea of progress. So if you can't accept that maybe things will never be as perfect as you want them to be, but that they are becoming better, then you won't make further progress. I mean, who's going to want to make progress who's going to even want to engage if you're told you are inherently an evil person by being, first of all, this whole idea that people that come from other places are part of the whole settler group. I mean, my grandparents escaped persecution in Europe and came here. I've never had anything to do with this, the residential schools. Like I can look at them objectively and say, oh, they maybe should have rethought that one, but I'm not going to accept guilt for it. I just don't. And so if you don't, then you are one of the bad people because you refuse to recognize your inherent. So when you start talking about inherent guilt because of the color of your skin or because of your non-Aboriginal status or anything like that, you lose me. I think you lose most rational people who just aren't going to accept you labeling them that. So yeah, there has been progress. And by the way, one thing you're not allowed to say, or one of the many things you're not allowed to say, and why I sort of lost interest. 20 years ago, I wrote a column about how Indigenous peoples, Phil Fontaine, do you remember that name?
Yes.
Okay, so he was a chief that compared Indigenous peoples to the Jews. And he said they were, they were in exile, and they were, he made a few analogies to the history of the Jews. And I wrote a column saying, okay, that's sort of an interesting analogy. How did the Jews survive, and how did they thrive? And I was able to write a column that suggested there has to be a way to make indigenous culture portable. The reason the Jews survived was because they had a constitution, they had their Torah, it was written down, and they had literacy. And they were able to live in exile, in the diaspora, with no help, no financial help, no nothing, no encouragement, in fact, a lot of discouragement. They were able to stay united and to not to slip into dysfunction, because they had their culture was able to be transferred from one place to another. And they, even though they retained their attachment to a sacred territory, to a sacred place, Israel, they had to leave it, and they didn't get sovereignty over that territory back for 2,000 years. So I said, if you have to be on the land that you consider sacred in order to maintain your culture, and if it's not tenable to be on that land and thrive, then you have a problem that can't be fixed by money or by other people. You have to make your culture somehow portable so that you can live off the land in other places and not fall apart. So I was able to express that opinion. Do you think I could write that today? No, I could not. I couldn't. But it was not written without compassion, but it was written with a sense that, well, this problem is not entirely on the shoulders of the settler class, or whoever you want to call us. There has to be some responsibility taken by the group itself, by the culture itself, that is failing to thrive in their sacred places without life support all the time, and plenty of it from outside. So I can't say that now, but I do believe that. So I don't write about it. So right. That's one of the effects of this whole idea of where we are now as compared to where we were then.
One of the things that you've been writing about that most columnists are desperately avoiding, though, is the gender issue. And I know that you have a book on this coming out, and I hope you'll join us again when it does come out. With the emergence of this gender identity issue, what did you first notice about this that it was dangerous? Because I think in Canada, you've probably been one of the most consistent columnists writing for a major broadsheet that covers this issue and very, very incisively and critically as well.
Thank you. Well, what I noticed was that, first of all, it was dealing with very young children, and there seemed to be a fascination with what goes on in children's minds. I noticed before the trans thing came along, I already was very uncomfortable with a lot of what was happening in sex education. It was starting concepts that I thought were far too advanced, were being taught as part of the curriculum younger and younger and younger. And these were components of curricula that were designed by gay activists. At that time, it wasn't trans; it was gay. That wanted young children to be very aware of concepts of sexuality before I think they were ready to talk about that or to be interested in that. Like, they would have grade 1 kids talking about homosexual love, but you can't talk about homosexual love unless you already understand what sexual desire is. Grade 1 children should not be taught in groups about sexual desire, because they're not prepared for that. They're in a latency period. That's not their interest. And I found the impulse to wish to be talking to children about this stuff had a component that I identify as voyeurism. And the same impulse was, I started writing about things like, you know how universities have sex weeks?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, probably for you, that's, oh yeah, that's routine. Well, it wasn't routine when I first started writing about it. It was quite, I remember Yale had a sex week and had all the students in auditoriums, and they were having people come and talk about bondage and sadomasochism, and they had prostitutes come and talk about sex toys and what they liked. And
yeah, Nathan Harden wrote a book about this.
Oh, yeah. I recognize that name. Okay. And I thought, man, this is kind of sick. These kids are at university, and the university is sponsoring this, and they're giving them like time off from lectures and everything to go to the auditoria and listen to all this stuff. And I thought, these are supposed to be adults, like 18-year-olds. There's something orgiastic about people in groups that are being exposed to titillating sexual material. They had porn stuff. They were watching porn, and the whole idea was, oh, this is a learning experience. But in fact, it was getting young people in groups to watch porn as a titillating thing. They had professors. It was very, very, maybe they're not doing it so much anymore. Maybe that was a little fad that disappeared. They were having, I remember there was one professor at Dawson University here who was having his students act out something that was transgressive. And one student got an A because they defecated into a garbage pail in front of the other student. I mean, there was a whole trend there towards transgressive sexual activity that was presented to groups. And this had its apex to me in, there was a traveling exhibition called the sex exhibit or something like that was going from city to city. It was government funded, and kids as young as 12 were being taken to it as part of their school excursions. And they had stuff in that sex exhibition that was really quite unsuitable, I considered, for 12-year-olds to be watching in groups. And I stress in groups because there's nothing wrong with children who are very young learning a lot about biology and reproduction and sex and everything else in private with a counselor or a parent or an older, someone who is responsible and sits down. It's an intimate situation and they learn privately. When you're learning in a group, it's a very different dynamic. So, for example, in that sex exhibition, there was a video that had line drawings of a young man and a young woman or teenagers masturbating, as if this is something that children have to learn how to do because, for 10,000 years of recorded human history, they didn't know how. So, they never learned because they didn't have this video. I'm kibitzing because the whole idea that you need to teach human beings how to masturbate is so stupid, as if that's not something that, like, the one thing you don't need to learn how to do is there's breathing, there's eating, there's drinking, and there's masturbating. I mean, that's something people figure out. So there was this sex ed thing, a sex exhibition thing with the line drawings. Now, in my mind, I saw the teacher with the children, and they're all standing watching this thing. But there's also strangers walking around. And now I'm picturing an adult male sidling over to watch the 12-year-olds watching the masturbatory video. And I said to myself, to me, it was all together with the sex ed week and the whole thing. This is a very pagan impulse, voyeurism. You read about these, the old pagan dances around the fire, and then and the drums and the drums and the drums, and then the writhing and the you see that in certain videos like dancing. There's some of the stuff Cardi B and all that. All right, I don't want to go off on that tangent, but anyways, stop me. So I wrote a column about that because it made me sick. I mean, well, not really, but I mean, it made me mentally sick to think that teachers why are they so eager to expose these kids to giant phalluses and like in a group.
It's weird.
It's weird.
It is weird. No, it's worse than weird though. It's adults, to me, that have a kind of fetishistic and voyeuristic interest in watching children, not the sex act itself, but you're watching a mental activity, like a kind of virgin experience for these kids as they see stuff they've not been exposed to before. Although I have to say, by the age of 12, I understand that most kids have been watching porn,
since age 9 now, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's quite normal now, but that's something I didn't know then. But I thought that teachers and schools should not be contributing to that particular kind of culture. So I wrote about that. And then I was kind of in a way prepared for the trans thing.
Right.
Because it's sort of the same impulse. It's adults that want to get into children's heads and manipulate their views of their own body, their own genitals, particularly the genitals. They're very fixated on a child's genitals, and they're very fixated on working with a child to make that child come alive to ideas that they're very incoherent to them, but it has to do with their body, their sexuality, their this, their that. It's an invasion. It's a voyeuristic invasion of a child's mind that I find repellent. There's a pathology that is attached to this obsession with gender. And I think we're going to look back on this whole thing with a sense of wonderment that we allowed people with serious pathological tendencies to be writing the rules for what is taught in school, what you can and cannot say, and all the rest. I don't know. There's something really quite disturbing that's going on there.
It's interesting you say that because Anthony Eslin, who's one of the most incisive cultural commentators, his book Out of the Ashes is just phenomenal. He actually said, the more somebody wants to teach kids about sex, the less I want that person doing it.
Yeah. To want to do that. I remember when I was gearing up to teach my own children about, sex. I'm not a prude, but my own sense of modesty. Mm-hmm. Talk about this with my own children. Obviously, you have to at some point, and you explain and all that. But I also wanted them to have their own sense of sexual modesty. And interesting, I guess that's something that kids pick up in the home, mm-hmm. because their children are. It comes very naturally to them. And that, I think, is what the healthy thing is. And we're constantly being told that if you're reticent to talk about your own body, your own sex, your own whatever, then that's unhealthy.
If you have any sense of privacy, it's a bad thing.
The whole idea of privacy or intimacy, or, well, this is something that you should discuss with one person. No. With the class, with the world, with the videos, with the, and here's where if you can't draw the line between what is obviously meant to be private with what is clearly not meant to be shared in the public domain, and it's all just, you have no boundaries, then you're a person who I think I'd want to not be dealing with my kid anyways, or grandchildren. Mm-hmm. So that's not healthy. That's not healthy. And by the way, when you said what brought you into journalism and everything else, I think what for me, when I'm drawn to a topic and I say, how come this topic excites me? And the other one is, yeah, I could write about that, but it won't be joyful to write about that. I say to myself, it's always the same, always comes back to the same thing. What is it that makes a society healthy and what makes it unhealthy? What makes a neighborhood a good place to live and what makes it a less attractive neighborhood to live in? And it gets right down to what's a good family, what's not like you can start with the lowest common denominator, work right up to the biggest, to what makes a country a healthy country. And right now there's a lot of unhealthy trends. Mm-hmm. But that's what attracts me. And it's almost always a cultural or social aspect.
So I've taken a lot of your time, so I'll ask you one final question. What does your book cover?
I should say it's Linda Blade's book. She is the actual writer. Linda Blade is a former Olympian level heptathlete who has been a longtime coach of both men and women in sport. She has a PhD in kinesiology, which is a form of biology. And she is one of, I think, the only sports coach in Canada who is actively speaking out against male bodies in female sports. That, of course, is not only the trend, that is official policy in Canada. And I encouraged her. I helped her start her kind of journalistic career by writing some op-eds on the subject, and we formed a friendship and a good feeling of working together in the writing end. And I said, what if you wrote a book and I could help you with it editorially and contribute brainstorming and all that. And she jumped on it. And so our book is now with the publisher, and it's a short book. It's called Unsporting. How trans activism and science denial are destroying sport, and it is basically the invasion of women's. It's all sport is suffering from it, but the focus is on the invasion of women's sports by trans women whose male bodies have an advantage that is so extreme and especially in elite sports that it just isn't possible for women to enjoy a level playing field, and that's what it's about.
Well, I look forward to reading it. And Barbara, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
It's my pleasure, Jonathan. Thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was my conversation with Canadian columnist Barbara Kay, who writes for the National Post. Thank you so much for joining us this week. And if you want to check out past shows or subscribe to get the show delivered to you weekly, please head over to lifesitenews.com and click on the podcast tab, where you can, again, check out past interviews and sign up to get the new interviews that we have coming out weekly delivered directly to you. We really do appreciate you taking the time to join us this week, and we hope you'll join us again next week.